Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, February 14th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The U.S. gives Israel the green light to kill civilians in Rafah. The U.S. has given Israel the green light to kill civilians in Rafah despite public comments from U.S. officials calling for Israel to come up with a plan to protect civilians in the city, which is packed with an estimated 1.5 million Palestinians. So U.S. officials told Politico that the Biden administration was not planning any consequences for Israel if it went ahead with a major assault on Rafah, which would inevitably kill a large number of civilians. The Politico report said, quote, "No reprimand plans are in the works, meaning Israeli forces could enter the city and harm civilians without facing American consequences," end quote. So all that talk about the U.S., cautioning against attacking Rafah, that report saying that Biden told Netanyahu he had to come up with a plan to protect the civilians, it was all just talk. When it comes down to it, the U.S. is going to support whatever Israel does in Gaza. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby basically made that clear at a press conference on Monday. He was asked if the U.S. threatened to withhold aid to Israel, and he said, quote, "We're going to continue to support Israel, and we're going to continue to make sure that they have the tools and the capabilities to do that," end quote. So President Biden is also not reconsidering his full-throated support for the Israeli slaughter, despite these reports of him privately disparaging Netanyahu. I covered that yesterday. And Congress is also on board with continuing to support the mass killing of Palestinians. I'm always talking about the Biden administration, but it's important to point out how the majority of Congress is all in on this slaughter in Gaza. The Senate actually passed the $95 billion foreign military aid bill early Tuesday morning. I'll get into that I have a whole story about it, a few stories about it actually. And when it comes to the Democrats and Republicans, more Democrats supported that bill than Republicans, but that's because of the border dispute. When it comes to Israel, Republicans, virtually all Republicans support arming Israel, even as they're killing so many Palestinians in Gaza. There's more dissent on the Democrat side when it comes to Israel and Gaza. It's the opposite when it comes to Ukraine. And one important point to make about Rafah is that the pre-war population is 275,000. So that means the population has increased basically fivefold due to the Palestinians who have been displaced, from northern Gaza, from Khan Yunis now, from throughout Gaza. It's about more than half of Gaza's population is in this small city. And the people are in the street. So a big Israeli assault would kill so many people, so many civilians. All right, so the next one here. Israel proposes creating a U.S.-funded tent city to evacuate Rafah. So this article is from the Wall Street Journal. I don't know if there's really much to this, if this is just an idea that they had. It doesn't seem like this is really going to move forward, but I wanted to write it up because just kind of the audacity of this plan that Israel has apparently proposed to Egypt. So Israel has proposed creating a U.S.-funded tent city in Gaza, tent cities, plural actually, as part of a potential evacuation plan for Rafah. And this was reported by the Wall Street Journal, and they cited Egyptian officials. So under this Israeli proposal, 15 campsites of around 25,000 tents each would be created along Gaza's coast to house the millions of Palestinians sheltering in Rafah. The Egyptian officials said that Egypt would be responsible for establishing the campsites and that the U.S. and its Arab partners are expected to pay for the tent cities. So Israel's great idea is that you pay for it, you set it up. If you care, basically the attitude here is, if you care so much about the Palestinian civilians, why don't you build them tent cities? Saying that Egyptian officials, Egypt should come into Gaza and do this. That's not something Egypt is going to want to do. So this does just seem like a kind of a non-starter of a proposal that they threw out there, maybe to act like they're trying to think of something here. And then, the reality is, how practical is this when Israel has also bombed, many of these areas that they claimed were safe zones? The UN is saying that it will not be part of any further displacement of Palestinians because there's nowhere safe for them to go. They're calling, for de-escalation and everything. And if you're a Palestinian, it's going to be tough to trust, to follow Israeli orders. All right, so the next one here, South Africa asks the ICJ to order Israel to halt the Rafah offensive. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. It says, South Africa has petitioned the International Court of Justice to take emergency action as Israel plans an offensive on a Gazan city sheltering about 2/3 of Palestinians living in the Strip. Israel and the U.S. have rebuked the court for finding that Israel was potentially committing genocide in Gaza. So, a statement from South Africa said, quote, the South African government has made an urgent request to the ICJ to consider whether the decision announced by Israel to extend its military operations in Rafah, which is the last refuge for surviving people in Gaza, requires that the court uses its power to prevent further imminent breach of the rights of Palestinians in Gaza, end quote. So basically, I think the angle is that the ICJ ruling was that Israel's potentially committing a genocide, and they ordered Israel to stop doing anything or to not do anything that might violate the genocide convention. So the argument is, well, if they attack Rafah, how is that violates the genocide convention, so you should order them to stop the military operation. All right, so the next one here, Israeli airstrikes wipe out entire Palestinian family in Rafah. So this article is from AP, and this was from the bombardment that happened Sunday night into Monday morning. Ibrahim Rasuna trudged over the rubble of the destroyed house, pointing out where family moments had taken place, where his mother and sister-in-law used to sleep, where he played with his 5-year-old nieces, where he helped his 1-year-old nephew take his first steps. His entire family was now dead, his parents, his 2 brothers, and the wife and 3 children of one of those brothers. The house was reduced to rubble on top of them in a barrage of airstrikes that Israeli warplanes inflicted across Rafah before dawn on Monday as cover for troops rescuing 2 hostages elsewhere in the town on the southern Gaza border. So basically, Israel said that those airstrikes were just cover for the ground operation. They didn't even try to say that they were hitting Hamas or anything. And at least 74 Palestinians were killed in the bombardment. Some other sources have said it's around 100, but at least 74 were killed. And the bombardment flattened large swaths of buildings and tents, sheltering families who had fled to Rafah from across Gaza. Among the dead were 27 children and 22 women, according to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, whose researchers compiled the list from Rafah hospitals. The Israeli offensive has taken a heavy toll on women and children, with more than 12,300 Palestinian children killed in the conflict. So just a, horrific case of what's happening on the ground in Rafah, and just a taste of what could happen if Israel launches, a full-scale assault on this city. This could happen, all over the city every night for however long it lasts. And I think one thing just to mention, going back to Israel's proposal to creating the 10 cities, I mentioned in that story that back in October, there was a leaked Israeli intelligence ministry document that said the best case scenario for Israel is for all 2.3 Palestinians living in Gaza to be expelled into Egypt. And that really said a lot, that they had like these different scenarios for basically a post-war Gaza. And the best case was all of the Palestinians out into Egypt. Israeli government ministers have also not been shy about their desire to cleanse Gaza of the Palestinian population and resettle it. But Egypt is still holding firm on its position that it will not allow an influx of refugees into its territory. And I think part of the Israeli plan here is they're probably hoping that they can wear down Egypt, wear down the U.S., and get them to say, all right, I guess open up, let them into Egypt. But Cairo seems to be holding very firm against that position. But I'm sure that is part of the thinking here, part of the calculations. Rafah's it's the last, stop in Gaza before Egypt. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu rejects an Israeli hostage deal outline. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected an outline for a potential hostage deal with Hamas that was drawn up by Israel's Mossad spy agency, the Shin Bet security agency, and the Israeli Defense Forces. So according to the Times of Israel, the proposal was put together by the head of Mossad, the head of Shin Bet, and Major General Nitzan Alon, who is an IDF officer in charge of intelligence efforts to find Israeli hostages in Gaza. So that's who drew up this outline, this proposal, and Netanyahu said no. And details of the outline are unclear, but it was likely a response to Hamas's recent counteroffer for a 135-day truce to facilitate the release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners and a permanent ceasefire. The proposal was discussed with Netanyahu several times, including during a preparatory meeting for hostage deal talks in Egypt that were held on Tuesday. And so these hostage deal talks in Egypt happened on Tuesday, and that was attended by Barnea, the head of Mossad, as well as William Burns, the head of the CIA, Qatar's prime minister, and Egyptian officials. And there was no breakthroughs, no deals were made, no agreements were really reached or anything. And the Times of Israel report said that Netanyahu declined to present this new outline that his top officials drew up for a hostage deal at these talks. And he told Barnea, who was representing Israel at the talks, to only listen and not put forward any new ideas. So Netanyahu showing that he has no interest in negotiations. And he publicly rejected Hamas's last offer and said total victory was the only option for Israel. And he's now preparing this invasion of Rafah. According to President Biden, the deal that's on the table that was discussed in Egypt would involve a 6-week truce, but it's unclear if Hamas is receptive to that idea. A Hamas official speaking to AFP signaled that the Palestinian group was still looking for a permanent ceasefire, saying that Hamas was awaiting the outcome of the Cairo talks and was open to discussing any initiative that achieves an end to the aggression and war. So they're still saying that they want a permanent end to this thing, which is really a non-starter for Netanyahu. All right, so the next one here, Ben Gvir says that Israel should shoot Palestinian women and children. So Israeli Minister of National Security Itamar Ben Gvir, very big, prominent position in the Netanyahu government, he said on Sunday that Israeli forces should shoot Palestinian women and children in Gaza if they get too close to the Israeli border. So Ben Gvir said this during an argument with the head of the IDF, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, about the IDF's open fire policies, basically saying they should be able to shoot and kill whoever they want. Ben Gvir said, according to the Jerusalem Post, quote, "We cannot have women and children getting close to the border. Anyone who gets near must get a bullet in the head," end quote. So after his comments leaked to the press, Ben Gvir doubled down. In a post on X, the Israeli minister said he, quote, "does not stutter and does not intend to apologize. All those who endanger our citizens by getting near the border must be shot. This is what they do in any normal state," end quote. In his role as Minister of National Security, Ben Gvir oversees the Israeli police, including the border police. He and Halevi also argued about the IDF cooperating with Israeli police to crack down on protests against humanitarian aid entering Gaza at the Kerem Shalom border crossing from Israel into Gaza. So apparently these protests were going on. Israelis were trying to block the humanitarian aid, and the police were basically standing down. The police are under Ben Gvir. Then the military got them to help them clear up some of these protests, and I think they arrested some people. So Ben Gvir apparently got in a screaming match with the head of the IDF about this. So, this just goes to show, Ben Gvir is, an extremist in Israeli politics. He was always considered very fringe and extreme, and he's had this prominent position in the Netanyahu government since the end of 2022 now. So he's not a fringe figure anymore. He's in the government, in a pretty serious position. And he's saying, shoot Palestinian women and children in the head. And the next one here is a similar story. Israeli minister blocks U.S. flour shipments into Gaza. So Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich is blocking a U.S.-funded flour shipment into Gaza that Netanyahu apparently vowed would be allowed into the Strip. Officials told Axios that Netanyahu personally made the commitment to President Biden several weeks ago, and that the Israeli War and Security Cabinets approved the delivery to be made through Israel's Kerem Shalom crossing into Gaza. And Smotrich's office say that he blocked the shipment because it's going to the UN Relief and Works Agency. That's their Palestinian relief agency, UNRWA. Israel recently accused 12 UNRWA employees of participating in the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, but the intelligence dossier the allegations were based on provides no evidence for the claim, according to the media outlets that obtained the document. Regardless of the lack of evidence, the U.S. and several other countries suspended funding for UNRWA as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are facing famine-like conditions. And the head of UNRWA actually admitted that he fired the employees that Israel alleged were involved in the attack without evidence. They made the allegation and he fired them right away. So he said there's an investigation ongoing, and if he finds that it was wrong to fire them, they'll be compensated. Smotrich is claiming that UNRWA is a central part of the Hamas war machine. His office said that he was blocking the shipment in coordination with Netanyahu and claimed that it would be able to go through if they found a new delivery mechanism. But I think he's just trying to hold up more aid. Aid deliveries, any delays in aid shipments could mean death for the Palestinians in Gaza. Palestinians are beginning to starve to death, but according to ANRA, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, ANERA, ANRA, which is an American aid group that operates in the region, they're saying that the scale of famine-related deaths is unclear at this point because it's not being properly tracked. The aid group said that one of its staffers had heard from a friend in North Gaza who lost their 6-year-old son to starvation. So we're starting to see reports of Palestinians dying because they don't have enough food. The aid group said in a press release, quote, "In the tragic circumstances of starvation in Gaza, there's a compounding issue. Many who perish from starvation-related symptoms are not accurately documented. Their deaths often get attributed to other physical causes, masking the true toll of starvation," end quote. All right, so the next one here, the Senate passes the $95 billion foreign military aid bill. So this was on very early Tuesday morning. I saw this when I woke up very early in the morning, and I looked at my phone and I said, Senate, what? That can't be right. And it's because they worked all night. That's how much they care about getting this foreign military aid out there. The Senate worked overnight. And during that session, I know Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and what's his name, J.D. Vance, all kind of spoke out against it, but didn't matter. The bill passed in a vote of 70-29, with 22 Republicans and nearly every Democrat voting to pass the legislation. Only 2 Democrats, Senator Peter Welch, Democrat from Vermont, and Senator Jen Merkley, Democrat from Oregon, voted against the spending package. Bernie Sanders also voted against it. He's technically an independent. So I saw a quote from Merkley. I never heard of him. I haven't come across his name, but he said this on X. Quote, "I voted no on sending more bombs and shells to Israel. The campaign conducted by the Netanyahu government is at odds with our American values and American law, which requires recipients of American assistance to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid," end quote. The bill's fate in the House is unclear, as Speaker Mike Johnson suggested that he might not bring it to the floor for a vote. He said in a statement on Monday, quote, so this was before it was passed, "In the absence of having received any single border policy change from the Senate, the House will have have to continue to work in its own on these important matters, end quote. So he's not, I don't know. People are saying he's rejecting it. He's come out completely against it, but I haven't really seen that, and I know McConnell's really putting the screws on him, and I know he said they should send more money to Ukraine, and of course he wants to get more money to Israel. He tried to pass that standalone bill recently, so we'll see what happens. And now there's other ways. So if he doesn't want to bring it to the floor for a vote, there are other ways that can happen. Democratic proponents of the bill could work on getting enough signatures for what they call a discharge petition, which would bypass leadership to hold a vote on the legislation. They would need just a handful of Republicans to go along with that. Actually, it depends on how many of the progressive Democrats are going to vote against this because of Israel. I think there's a chance that a few dozen of them in the House might. So you would need maybe a few dozen Republicans to sign this petition. If it comes for a vote, if it came up for a vote tomorrow, it would pass. I think it's pretty clear that it would make it through the House. The challenge for the Hawks is getting it on the floor for a vote. So we'll see what happens. And this is $95 billion, including $60 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion for the Israeli slaughter in Gaza, $4.8 billion for Taiwan and other spending in the region. It also includes another $3 billion on spending on AUKUS. So that's China-related spending as well. AUKUS is that military pact between the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. that they signed in 2021, and that's all about getting nuclear-powered submarines to Australia and other kind of technology sharing. All right, so the next one here, Senator Van Hollen calls the Israelis war criminals and votes to send aid. So Chris Van Hollen, he's a Democrat from Maryland. He had this big speech on the Senate floor on Monday. He called the Israelis war criminals for intentionally withholding food from Gaza as children are starving. But on Tuesday morning, he voted yes on the bill to send them $14 billion in military aid. So he said on the floor, quote, "Kids in Gaza are now dying from the deliberate withholding of food. In addition to the horror of that news, one other thing is true. That is a war crime. It is a textbook war crime, and that makes those who orchestrate it war criminals," end quote. So the question is, what does that make you? What does that make people voting to send the war criminals more weapons? The senator said that President Biden must, quote, "demand that the Netanyahu government immediately allow more food and water and other life-saving supplies into Gaza and make sure it reaches the children and other people who are starving," end quote. If Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu does not agree to the demands, Van Hollen said President Biden should invoke Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act. Section 620I is designed to cut off arms exports to any country that restricts the delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance. Van Hollen also attempted to justify, so in the same speech, he then went on to say why he was going to vote for this, and he said it's because of the $60 billion for Ukraine and the $9.2 billion in humanitarian assistance for Ukraine, Gaza, and other war zones that's also packed in there. He said that's enough of a reason to give more weapons to the military that's killed 12,300 Palestinian children. So what's the point, I don't know, of the speech if you're just going to vote for it? All right, so the next one here, Norway warns that Russia is stronger now than a year ago. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. A top Norwegian official warned that Ukraine was facing multiple challenges and Russia was getting stronger. The assessment was made as the U.S. and Europe looked to commit over $100 billion to the Ukrainian war effort. And on the battlefield, Kiev is facing a shortage of soldiers and arms. So this is the head of Norway's military intelligence unit who said, quote, "In this war, Russia is currently in a stronger position than it was a year ago and is in the process of gaining the advantage. Russia could mobilize around 3 times more troops than Ukraine," end quote. And I know I've seen reports saying that Russia is, firing artillery at a rate of 10-1. And we've seen the, reports of the manpower shortages, battalions barely having any people in them and barely having any weapons, while Russia has really mobilized, and is going on more of like a war footing economy. And, Russia just is bigger, has more industrial capacity and more manpower. That's just the reality. All right. So the next one, the last story here, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin released from the hospital. This article is from Politico. Just an update that Austin, so he went to the hospital the other day for some sort of bladder issue that was related to his prostate cancer surgery. This time he told people that he was going to the hospital and that he was out of work. The last time he didn't even tell the president, but it was just a couple days, and they're saying that he is resuming his full functions and duties Tuesday evening at 5 p.m. So that means he's back on the clock. As the head of the Pentagon, the former Raytheon board member, that's where he was working right before he got his job as the defense secretary. All right, so that's it for the news for today. One thing I just want to mention from yesterday, I was talking about the Defend the Guard stuff. I'm just going to leave the link to their website and to the phone bank for people who are interested. Again, this is something, as we're looking at all this horrific news, this is something that can really make a difference. Legislation at the state level to prohibit the federal government from deploying the National Guard into active war zones that have not been declared by Congress. And Congress doesn't declare wars anymore. They haven't done that since World War II. The National Guard is deployed in Syria, Somalia. It's really crazy that they send the National Guard over there. And I know they just passed some sort of committee in Georgia, so they're making some progress there. So go to defendtheguard.us, and you could see the different states, how everything is going. And then I'll put the link for the phone bank, which is training to really help them, before votes, to call and pester the politicians to get them to vote for this bill. Because whenever they bring this legislation to a state chamber, generals show up to tell them, don't vote for it. So if you have all these uniformed generals coming in, a state senator, state delegate is, going to be like, okay, all right, whatever. Unless you have a bunch of people making phone calls and making a big stink about it, making a big deal about it. That's really the only way this will get passed. So defendtheguard.us. Go check out our I really stumbled on that. Go check out our Viewpoints, one from Edward Lazansky, Indispensable Nation, or one obsessed with hegemony. One from James Carden, The Disinformation Complex and U.S. Foreign Policy. One from Roger D. Harris, Washington Promotes Venezuelan Opposition Candidate. And one from Kim Robinson, Who Will Fight These Wars Anyhow? One from Jack Merkinson, Biden is Mad at Netanyahu, Spare Me. And I think that's a fine attitude to have. You could always support us by liking, subscribing, commenting, all that stuff. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Oh, go check out our Instagram. So our Instagram account was kind of sitting there. It wasn't much action going on for a while, but a listener, a viewer of this show has volunteered to do some really good posts over there, and it's starting to look really nice. I struggled for a while to try to figure out how to Instagram, like with the news articles and stuff. So the handle is at antiwarcom. Some clips from this show and stuff. So it's really looking nice. I'm very happy with it, and I really appreciate the help. So yeah, that's it for me. I think that's all I got. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.